I used to think that after 62 years of life and nearly 4 decades of marriage, I had seen every shade of routine. My husband and I had long ago slipped into a rhythm that was more about survival than passion, more about shared bills than shared dreams. He was steady, respectable, the kind of man people admired at community dinners. And yet, in the quiet hours, he felt like a stranger sitting across the table from me. The house had grown quiet over the years, too quiet. The children were gone, scattered into lives of their own. The conversations between my husband and me had become fragments: weather reports, shopping lists, the occasional polite inquiry about the day. I carried the silence like an extra weight, heavier than the years in my bones. One evening in late spring, as I was rinsing plates under the kitchen faucet, he cleared his throat behind me. "My cousin Kareem," he said matter-of-factly, as though it were a small note on a grocery list. "He's coming to the city to study. He needs a place for a while. I told him we could offer the extra room." I didn't argue. What was there to argue about? The guest room had been empty for years, gathering dust and lost echoes of children's laughter. Still, the thought of someone new in our quiet home unsettled me. I nodded and said, "Of course," though my voice lacked conviction. When Kareem arrived a week later, dragging a worn suitcase and flashing a polite smile, I felt a strange flicker inside me. He was 25, my husband's cousin, though so much younger that the word hardly seemed to fit. His eyes were dark, thoughtful, the kind that seemed to notice more than they admitted. He thanked us graciously, his accent soft but clear, and when he shook my hand, I felt his palm warm against mine. At first, I kept my distance. He was here for studies, nothing more. I was his host, nothing less. But I couldn't ignore the way the house changed when he entered it. The silence wasn't as sharp anymore. Footsteps in the hallway, the sound of his voice on the phone in Arabic, the smell of his late-night tea, all of it filled corners I thought would remain empty forever. My husband barely noticed. He left early for work, came home late, and often went straight to bed. Kareem, however, moved through the house with a kind of gentle presence, asking if I needed help with groceries, offering to carry heavy bags, sharing stories about his university classes. I told myself it was nothing, just politeness, just youthful kindness. But somewhere deep down, I felt a stirring I hadn't in years, a reminder that I was more than a wife, more than a housekeeper, more than someone who had grown used to being unseen. And though I didn't know it then, by opening that door to Kareem, by agreeing to let him take the extra room, I had also opened a door inside myself, one that would lead me somewhere I never imagined I'd go. Kareem brought the smell of fresh beginnings into a house that had long smelled only of polish and silence. When he arrived that Saturday morning, the spring sun poured through the front windows as though it had been waiting just for him. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, polite but not stiff, and I noticed immediately the way he looked at people when they spoke, as if he was truly listening. It had been years since I'd felt that kind of attention from anyone, least of all my husband. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of the desert, smooth and low. He set his suitcase down carefully, not like a burden, but like something he didn't want to intrude with. "It's no trouble," I replied, though my throat felt tight. My husband, standing beside me, gave a perfunctory nod, already glancing at his watch, already half gone in his mind. We showed him to the guest room, the one at the end of the hallway that had once belonged to my daughter. I had spent the previous night changing sheets, airing out curtains, setting a small vase of flowers on the nightstand as though Karim would notice such a detail. When he smiled at the sight, I felt a small warmth rise in my chest, a warmth I quickly smothered. That evening, my husband disappeared into his study after dinner, muttering something about paperwork. Karim lingered in the kitchen, rinsing his plate. "You don't have to do that," I said, reaching for it. He shook his head. "I don't mind. Back home, my mother would scold me if I left a dish in the sink." He smiled, wide, genuine, the kind that lit his entire face. I realized then how long it had been since I had seen a smile like that in this house. As the days unfolded, Karim settled into our lives with an ease that both comforted and unsettled me. He rose early for his classes, his textbooks spread across the dining table. Sometimes, when I left for work, I'd catch the faint smell of strong coffee and the soft scratch of his pen as he studied. In the evenings, when my husband worked late, Karim and I often crossed paths in the kitchen. He would ask about my day, and though I always answered modestly, something in his gaze told me he sensed the heaviness I carried. One night, I found myself telling him about the garden, how I used to tend it every weekend but had let it go in recent years. "It's hard to keep up," I admitted, staring at the weeds that choked the once bright flower beds. "Maybe I can help," he said simply, without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And though I wanted to protest, the words caught in my throat. He was just being kind, that's all, I told myself. But when he bent to lift a heavy bag of soil the next day, his forearm tensing, his smile easy as he handed me the lighter tools, I felt something shift. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was awareness, the awareness of being noticed, considered, seen. And that night, as I lay beside my husband, his back turned to me as always, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of a new truth pressing against my chest. Karim was not just a guest in our home. He was a presence, a reminder of everything I thought I had lost long ago. The first time it happened, it was almost by accident. It was a Tuesday night, one of those evenings where the air itself felt heavy, pressing into the walls of the house. My husband had taken his dinner early and retreated into his study, shutting the door behind him as though the rest of the house didn't exist. I cleared the plates, rinsed the pans, and then poured myself a glass of wine. Just one, I told myself, though lately one had too easily become two. I sat at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the dim lamp above the sink. The house was quiet, except for the muffled hum of my husband's television drifting through the study door. It was the same every night, him with his screens, me with my silence. But then I heard footsteps on the stairs. Karim appeared in the doorway, barefoot, his hair slightly tousled, a book in his hand. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He smiled faintly. "Too much reading today. My mind won't switch off." He gestured toward the kettle. "Do you mind if I make tea?" "Of course not," I said, pushing myself up instinctively, but he shook his head. "Please, sit. I'll make it." It was such a small thing, a young man boiling water in my kitchen, and yet it unsettled me. I wasn't used to someone insisting I rest, someone seeing that I might need the chair more than they did. I watched as he moved around the space, careful with the mugs, precise with the sugar. He carried himself with a kind of quiet respect, like every action mattered, like nothing was done in haste. When he placed a steaming cup in front of me, I noticed the way the warmth reached my hands before I even touched it. "Thank you," I murmured. He sat across from me, his book resting on the table, but he didn't open it. Instead, he looked at me with that calm attentiveness of his. "You seem tired," he said gently. The words slipped under my skin more easily than I expected. I gave a short laugh. That's what happens when you reach my age. Tired becomes a permanent state. He tilted his head, considering me. "I don't think it's just age," he said quietly. "I think it's loneliness." My chest tightened. The truth of it hit too quickly, too directly, and I had to glance away, pretending to sip my wine. "You shouldn't say such things," I whispered. "Why not?" His voice was calm, not challenging, just honest. "It's not a weakness to admit it. Everyone needs to be seen, to be heard." I stared at him, trying to read if his words were rehearsed or careless. But no, they were sincere. His dark eyes held mine without judgment, and I felt something inside me shift. I hadn't been looked at that way in years, maybe decades. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not as someone filling a role, but simply as a woman who existed here and now. The silence stretched thick with something unnamed. Finally, I managed a soft laugh to break it. "You're too wise for 25. He smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting with warmth. Maybe, or maybe I've just seen what happens when people go unseen. The words lingered between us. I wanted to ask more, but I didn't trust myself. Instead, I nodded, tracing the rim of my glass with my finger. The kitchen light flickered, casting shadows across his face, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of guilt. He was family, my husband's cousin. He was young enough to be my son. And yet, here I was, listening to him breathe in the same silence that had once suffocated me. And suddenly, it didn't feel suffocating. When he finally stood to leave, he placed his empty mug in the sink and glanced back at me. "Good night," he said softly, his voice almost tender. "Good night, Karim," I replied, my heart still echoing the truth he had spoken so easily. And as I sat there alone again, staring into the shadows, I realized the first crack had appeared. Small, maybe invisible to anyone else, but I could feel it. The wall I had built around myself for years had shifted. And once cracks appear, no matter how small, they have a way of spreading. It had been one of those days that dragged me across the hours like a rag caught under a carriage wheel. Meetings at work had bled into one another, my body stiff from sitting, my patience worn thin from being asked the same questions by colleagues who refused to think for themselves. When I finally stepped into the house that night, every part of me felt heavy. My husband was, as usual, in his study. The light under his door was a narrow strip of gold, a wall between us. I didn't bother knocking. We hadn't shared more than surface words in weeks. Instead, I went straight for the wine rack, poured a glass before I even took off my coat, and let the liquid soften the edges of my exhaustion. One glass turned into two. By the third, I was on the living room carpet, back against the couch, Miles Davis spinning on the old turntable. The music curled through the air like smoke, easing the tightness in my chest. For the first time all day, I felt I could breathe. That's when the front door clicked open. My breath caught. My husband never used that door. He came through the garage. It was Karim. He stepped inside quietly, his bag slung over one shoulder, his hair damp with evening rain. He paused when he saw me on the floor, wine glass in hand, shoes discarded haphazardly by the door. "Auntie?" he asked softly, the word careful, respectful. I flushed with sudden embarrassment. I wasn't his aunt, not really. I was only his cousin's wife. But the way he said it made me feel both older and smaller. "Long day," I muttered, swirling the glass as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Just decompressing. He didn't smile. He didn't tease. He simply stepped further into the room, setting his bag aside. He lowered himself onto the carpet beside me, not too close, not too far, just enough to make me feel less ridiculous. "Are you okay?" he asked. The words landed heavier than I expected. They were simple, yet no one had asked me that in a long, long time. Not my husband, not my colleagues, not even my children when they called once a month out of duty. I could have lied. I could have laughed it off, hidden behind a shield of irony the way I always did. But something about the way he asked, steady, calm, unjudging, broke me open. "No," I whispered. "Not really." The confession startled me as much as it did him. My throat tightened, and before I knew it, words poured out. I told him about the exhaustion, about the way silence in the house had grown louder with every year. I told him about being strong at work, respected, dependable, and yet coming home with nothing left inside. I told him how I sometimes felt invisible, like the woman I once was had been swallowed by the roles I'd been forced to play. Kareem didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fix it. He just listened, really listened, and that alone made my eyes sting with unshed tears. "I didn't mean for you to see me like this," I said finally, wiping at the corner of my eye with the back of my hand. He gave me a small, gentle smile. "Maybe it's okay to fall apart sometimes." I looked at him then, really looked. He was only 25, but there was something steady in him, something that made me feel less ashamed. And without thinking, I let my head rest against his shoulder. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The music played on, the wine glowed in my glass like rubies, and I felt held. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally, completely. "You're always taking care of everyone else," he said softly. "Maybe it's time someone took care of you." The words unraveled something deep inside me, something I didn't know how to gather again. I didn't answer. I just let the silence wrap around us, thick and fragile. A silence that wasn't empty anymore, but full of possibility. And in that silence, I knew it. The second crack had appeared, larger this time, and from here, there would be no way to pretend the walls around me hadn't begun to crumble. The next morning, I woke with a dull ache behind my eyes and the faint taste of wine on my lips. For a moment, lying beneath the covers, I wondered if last night had been a dream. But when I padded barefoot into the kitchen, there was Karim, already awake, already moving about with the ease of someone who belonged. He was making tea. The kettle hissed, steam curling upward like a secret. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Good morning," he said, as if nothing unusual had passed between us. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Morning," I managed, tugging my robe tighter around me. He poured 2 cups, sliding one across the counter toward me without asking. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, the simple gesture anchoring me. My husband had left early, a note on the counter scribbled with an apology and a reminder about a meeting. As always, his absence was louder than his presence. Karim leaned back against the counter, sipping his tea, watching me with that same quiet attentiveness. There was no judgment in his eyes, no awkwardness, just warmth. "You didn't say too much last night," he said suddenly, as though plucking the thought straight from my chest. I looked up sharply, startled. "I thought maybe I had." He shook his head. "You said what you needed to say." His calmness disarmed me. I had expected distance, maybe even polite avoidance, Instead, he offered presence, steady and uncomplicated, and that, I realized, was more dangerous than anything else. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, one that felt both comforting and unsettling. My husband worked late more often than not, and in those empty hours, it was Karim who filled the silence. We cooked together sometimes, simple meals, pasta or grilled vegetables, nothing extravagant, yet I found myself looking forward to them as if they were feasts. One evening, as I chopped onions at the counter, Karim leaned close to reach for a pot. His sleeve brushed against mine, light as a whisper. I froze, my breath catching. He didn't move back immediately. Instead, his arm lingered, just enough to make me aware of him, of the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric. When he finally stepped away, it left a hollow space between us that felt impossibly wide. "You're quiet tonight," he said gently. I forced a smile, just tired. But the truth was, I wasn't tired. I was restless in ways I hadn't been for years, restless in ways that felt like betrayal, even though nothing had truly happened. Yet, in my heart, I knew something had already begun. At night, I found myself lying awake, listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the floorboards outside his room. I hated myself for it, and yet I couldn't stop. It wasn't desire, not exactly. It was the pull of being seen, of being acknowledged in the quiet moments when I had grown used to invisibility. One Saturday, I found him in the garden, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He was pulling weeds with strong, deliberate motions, clearing the patch I had abandoned long ago. "You didn't have to do that," I said, stepping outside, my voice softer than I intended. He looked up, brushing soil from his hands. "I wanted to. You said it used to make you happy. Maybe it can again." The words pierced deeper than they should have. No one had thought about what made me happy in years. Not my husband, not my children, but this young man with soil under his fingernails and sunlight in his hair had noticed. For a long moment, I simply stood there, my chest tight, the spring air cool against my skin. And in that moment, I realized the line was blurring. He was no longer just my husband's cousin, no longer just a guest. Something more dangerous was blooming between us, something neither of us dared name. It happened on a Thursday evening, though it could have been any night in that long, restless stretch of weeks. My husband had left for a business dinner, his cologne lingering faintly in the hallway, a ghost of the man who still called himself my partner, but no longer seemed to see me at all. I cooked a simple meal, roasted vegetables, bread, a glass of wine at my side, and Karim joined me in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, voice warm as he told me about his classes. We sat at the table together after dinner, the plates cleared, but neither of us rising to leave. The air between us was heavy with something unspoken, a weight that pressed closer with each passing moment. I sipped from my glass, the wine humming low in my blood, and found my eyes drawn to him longer than they should have been. "Your husband," Karim said softly, almost as if to himself, "he works too much." I gave a humorous laugh. He's always worked too much. I think, in his mind, providing was the same as loving. "And is it?" Karim asked. The question struck me, sharp and honest. I looked down at my hands, fingers curled around the stem of the glass. "No," I whispered, it isn't. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't empty. It was full of glances, of unsaid words, of truths neither of us had the courage to fully name. When I finally looked up, Karim was watching me. Not in the way men sometimes look at women, but in a way that felt deeper, like he was searching for something I had long forgotten I carried. His gaze didn't flinch, and in it, I felt more naked than if I had shed every layer of clothing. I should have risen then, broken the moment, retreated into the safe distance of roles and titles, but I didn't. Instead, I whispered, "You shouldn't look at me like that." He held my eyes. Like what? Like you see me. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The ticking of the clock faded. The hum of the refrigerator melted into silence. It was just us, suspended in a fragile truth neither of us had asked for. His hand moved first, slowly, carefully, as though afraid I might shatter if he reached too quickly. He laid it on the table, palm open, just inches from mine. An invitation, not a demand. My pulse thundered in my ears. I stared at his hand, the warmth radiating from it, the steadiness of the gesture. Every instinct screamed to pull back, to protect myself, to protect the fragile fabric of the life I still wore like an ill-fitting dress. And yet, almost against my own will, my fingers drifted forward until they brushed against his. The contact was feather-light, fleeting, but it was enough. The breath I drew in trembled. His thumb traced the side of my hand, slow, deliberate, reverent. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It wasn't lust. It was something older, more dangerous, recognition. I closed my eyes, letting the moment sink into me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. For the first time in years, someone had chosen to reach for me, not out of duty or habit, but because they wanted to. When I opened my eyes, Karim's gaze hadn't wavered. He didn't smile. He didn't rush. He simply held that space between us, steady and unwavering. It was such a small thing, the brush of two hands, the quiet acceptance of closeness, and yet it was everything. Because in that moment, the betrayal began, not in bed sheets or whispered confessions, but in the silent acknowledgement that what we shared was real and that neither of us wanted to turn away from it anymore. After that night at the table, nothing looked the same. The house, once so dull and predictable, had become a stage where every glance, every brush of fingers carried weight. I woke each morning in the same bed beside my husband, his back turned to me as always, his breathing steady and oblivious. I poured his coffee, passed him the morning paper, answered his small questions about the weather or errands. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inside me, everything had. Because once you've been seen, truly seen, it's impossible to pretend you're invisible again. Karim and I didn't speak of that moment, the hand against hand, the quiet betrayal pulsing between us. But it hung in the air like electricity. At breakfast, when I set a plate before him, my fingers brushed his by accident, and the air sharpened around us. In the evenings, when we lingered in the kitchen after dinner, our conversations grew longer, circling around meaning without ever naming it. And yet, in the presence of my husband, I lived the other life, the careful one, the dutiful one, the woman who smiled at the right moments, who listened to his grumbling about business meetings, who nodded when he said he'd be late again tomorrow. But even as I nodded, my mind was elsewhere. I thought of Karim's eyes, how steady they were, how unafraid of silence. I thought of his hands, warm against mine, the way his touch had felt less like temptation and more like recognition. The conflict gnawed at me. At night, lying in the dark beside a man who hadn't reached for me in years, I felt shame coil around my ribs. Betrayal was an ugly word, one I had never imagined wearing. And yet, in the quiet hours, when Karim's laughter drifted faintly from the guest room, I felt my heart betray me without permission. One evening, I caught myself in the mirror, 62 years old, lines carved into my skin, silver threads streaking through my hair. For so long, I had thought of myself as someone finished, someone who had stepped quietly into invisibility while the rest of the world surged past. But Karim's presence had fractured that illusion. He made me feel unfinished. He made me feel as though there was still something left to discover, not in him, but in myself. The garden became our meeting place. It was easier there, under the open sky, where silence could pass as thoughtfulness and not suspicion. He would tend the soil, sleeves rolled, while I pretended to prune roses that had long since withered. We didn't speak much in those moments. We didn't need to. The air between us carried more than words could. "Doesn't it feel strange?" I asked one afternoon, my voice barely above a whisper. "Living like this, under one roof, with him here." Karim straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. He met my gaze, steady, calm. "It only feels strange when you pretend nothing is wrong." His honesty sliced through me. He was right. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for years, long before he arrived with his suitcase and soft voice. He hadn't created the cracks. He had only revealed them. That night, my husband fell asleep on the couch, snoring gently, a newspaper folded across his chest. I stood in the doorway, watching him, and felt nothing. Not love, not anger, not even sadness, just emptiness. Then I turned, and in the hallway, Karim passed by silently. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that single look, the truth surged up between us. I was no longer fully my husband's wife, not in the ways that mattered. I was torn, split in two, but one side of me was already breaking free. It was late, later than I had planned to be awake. The house was hushed, the kind of silence that usually pressed down on me, but now it only heightened my awareness. My husband had gone to bed hours earlier, muttering something about an early meeting. His snores filtered faintly through the closed door of our bedroom. I should have been beside him, eyes closed, pretending at least that the shape of our lives still fit. But I wasn't. I was in the kitchen, barefoot, a glass of water clutched in my hand, staring out at the garden through the dark window. The moon cast pale light across the soil Karim had turned with such care, and I thought of him, of his hands pulling weeds, of his voice steady and unhurried. I didn't hear him approach at first. His voice broke the stillness. "Can't sleep?" I turned, startled, and there he was, Karim, standing in the doorway, t-shirt soft with wear, hair tousled, his eyes catching the low glow of the kitchen lamp. "No," I admitted, "too much on my mind." He stepped closer, not intruding, just present. "Me too." I tried to laugh, but it came out fragile. I shouldn't be here, I whispered. Why not? His voice was low, almost a breath. Because, I faltered, words tangling in my throat. Because you're his cousin. Because I'm his wife. Because this, I gestured weakly at the space between us, is already too much. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked at me, and in that gaze, I felt undone. It wasn't lust I saw in his eyes. It was recognition, steady and unflinching, a mirror reflecting back the loneliness I'd carried for years. You're not invisible, he said softly, not to me. The glass slipped from my hand onto the counter with a dull thud. My throat tightened. No one had said words like that to me in decades, perhaps ever. My husband provided, yes. He existed beside me, yes. But he had not seen me, not truly, for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like. And then the moment tipped. His hand reached out, slow, deliberate, as if asking permission. My heart thundered as I looked at it, at him, at the door, down the hall behind which my husband slept. The weight of choice pressed on me, sharp and suffocating. But I didn't step back. I placed my hand in his. The contact was gentle, reverent, like he feared I might break. My breath shuddered. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, a small, steady motion that sent tremors through me. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. I looked up at him, and before I could stop myself, the space between us collapsed. His lips brushed mine, tentative, questioning, yet carrying the force of everything we had tried not to say. The kiss was brief, delicate, but when it ended, the world had shifted. I stumbled back, pressing a hand to my mouth, shame and relief battling in my chest. We can't, I began, but the protest rang hollow. Karim's voice was steady. I know. And yet, I closed my eyes. The betrayal was real now, not imagined. The line had been crossed. When I finally spoke, my voice cracked. There's no going back, is there? No, he said quietly, but maybe we were never meant to. And with those words, the last of my resistance crumbled. The marriage I had clung to for appearances, for duty, for habit, it felt like paper in my hands. And in the silence of that kitchen, with the moonlight spilling across the floor and my husband's snores rumbling down the hall, I let myself fall into the truth I could no longer deny. After that night in the kitchen, nothing returned to normal. I tried, oh how I tried, to fold myself back into the life I'd lived for decades, to pour coffee for my husband without trembling, to sit at dinner and pretend I wasn't thinking of the warmth of Karim's hand or the ghost of his lips against mine. But the pretending became unbearable. I was two women now, the wife who smiled politely at her husband, and the woman who came alive in the presence of his cousin. One was a mask, polished and practiced. The other was raw, newly awakened, and impossible to bury again. Karim and I didn't rush toward each other. We didn't have to. It was in the glances stolen across the dinner table, in the way he lingered just a heartbeat longer when passing me the salt, in the quiet moments in the garden when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long. Every silence between us pulsed with the memory of that kiss, the one we couldn't take back. One evening, while my husband was away on another business trip, I found myself standing at the window, staring out at the darkened street. Karen entered quietly, as he always did, carrying the soft presence that had become more familiar to me than my husband's. "You're thinking too much," he said gently, setting a cup of tea beside me. I almost laughed. How could I not? I'm standing in the middle of two lives, and I can't live both forever. His eyes searched mine. "You don't have to." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "But to choose one is to betray the other. To choose you is to destroy everything I've built with him. A home, a name, a life." Karem stepped closer, his voice steady but tender. "And if that life is only a shell, if it's already gone?" The truth in his words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. My marriage hadn't been alive in years. What we shared now was little more than habit, a performance for the world. But still, I clung to it, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being abandoned, fear of starting again at 62. That night, lying beside my husband, his body turned away from mine, I stared at the ceiling until dawn. The silence between us was deafening. Not the silence of comfort or familiarity, but the silence of two people who had stopped looking at each other long ago. And I thought of Karim's words, "You're not invisible." Not to me. The next afternoon, while my husband sat in his study, Karim found me in the garden. He crouched beside me as I pulled at a stubborn weed, his voice low, urgent. "You can't stay like this," he said. "It's eating you alive." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. And what then? I walk away? At my age? I run into the unknown with you and never look back? His hand found mine, steady and sure. Maybe, if it means finally living. The simplicity of it broke me. All these years, I had been surviving, not living, not breathing freely, just existing in the spaces my husband left unoccupied. And here was Karim, offering not promises of perfection, not fairy tales, but something far more dangerous, truth. I looked at him then, really looked, at the man who was half my age, yet who had given me more honesty, more presence, more care in weeks than my husband had in years. The decision settled inside me like a storm breaking. "I can't stay," I whispered. Karim's eyes softened, though he said nothing. He didn't have to. The choice had already been made. And for the first time in decades, I felt alive enough to face the consequences. The morning it happened was deceptively ordinary. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter, glinting off the kettle as it whistled. My husband sat at the table, buried in the newspaper, his coffee untouched and already cooling. He didn't glance up when I placed toast beside him. "Big meeting today," he muttered absently, flipping a page. I nodded, though he didn't notice. My hands trembled as I wiped the counter, not from nerves, but from the sheer weight of what I had decided. I looked at him, the man I had spent nearly 40 years beside, and felt nothing but the echo of a life that had ended long before I had admitted it. By the time he left for work, briefcase in hand, his kiss grazing my cheek out of routine, my heart had already stepped beyond the walls of this house. I packed quickly, a single suitcase, clothes enough for a few weeks, a handful of keepsakes I couldn't bear to abandon, and the courage I had buried for too long. I slipped my wedding ring into the drawer of my nightstand, the band of gold suddenly heavier than stone. It didn't belong on my finger anymore. Karim was waiting in the car, parked down the street beneath the shade of an oak tree. He didn't look impatient. He never did. When I opened the door, he stood to take my bag, his hand brushing mine in a gesture that felt more like a vow than anything either of us could say. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, his dark eyes searching mine. "Yes," I whispered. My voice shook, but not from doubt, from release. I slid into the passenger seat, the leather cool against my skin. Karim placed the suitcase in the back, then settled beside me. For a moment, we sat in silence, the engine off, the world around us humming with ordinary life. Neighbors watering lawns, children chasing each other down the sidewalk. No one noticed us. No one knew the gravity of what was about to happen. When he finally turned the key, the engine roared to life. I glanced once more at the house I had called home for so many years. The windows stared back blankly, the garden half tamed, the study where my husband would soon return, expecting dinner and routine. But that life was no longer mine. As we pulled away, my chest tightened, then loosened all at once. The guilt was real, yes, but so was the freedom. For the first time in decades, I wasn't defined by obligation, by silence, by invisibility. For the first time in decades, I was not disappearing. I was seen. I was alive. And as the road stretched ahead of us, endless and uncharted, I knew I had chosen the only thing worth choosing. I had chosen to run.